This is Why So Mysterious, the podcast where we attempt to fill the gap between the bodies we have and the lack of knowledge around them.
We're sharing our experiences and answering our own questions,
with some help along the way,
to destigmatize tricky, taboo topics.
The triple T's.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Why So Mysterious. I'm Raven.
And I'm Sada.
And today we have Danika Kelly on to talk about sex and chromosomes. So Danika Kelly is the co-founder and chief executive officer of My Normative, Inc. She is a passionate advocate for and trained scholar in sex and gender issues in the arena of health and accessibility. Danika comes from both the world of high-performance sport as an athlete and a coach, as well as holding positions as an educator and practitioner in the lifestyle fitness arena in Western Canada.
Sure.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me back.
So, I kind of wanted to start today with asking you a little bit about yourself and how you kind of got into the type of work that you do. So how did you end up in this particular field of study, and then how did it lead you down the path to basically create a software that I'm assuming you felt was missing from an industry and the world?
That's a really good question, and I thought about trying to create a really concise answer for it. But then I figured that there were probably going to be spaces in which you were like, no, we need to tap into that a little bit more.
Absolutely.
So I will start off by saying this is not the job I imagined I would have as a child. I think in my high school yearbook, I was like, I'm going to be a teacher, teach your kids to be nice to each other. Like that was like, where I'm going to go with my career. And so I actually used to model full-time when I was younger. And at one point while I was in university, I was modeling and I was from school and I was like, I need to do something more meaningful. So I moved to West Africa and volunteered as a cultural anthropologist in a rowing medical clinic that specialized in conflict zones. And I was like, now I have meaning, which just notes to anybody who's 20 and thinking about just like trying to do something dramatic, go for it. Be prepared to be really wrong about everything.
Yeah. I mean, talk about a learning experience though.
You did you grow up in Alberta as well?
Victoria.
Oh, Victoria.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
yes.
Victoria to West Africa is a pretty big difference. So but that's amazing.
That's so funny.
Which was interesting, right? So I went over and I had these, I would say I got an opportunity because I hadn't even finished my undergraduate to really put into practice medical anthropology, which is like a cultural examination of health and wellness and how we define it. And I got to start to work towards what we call cultural brokership. So talking between different cultures about how we perceive and experience health. Okay. And so a really good example of that is if you've tried to ever explain germs to someone who's never heard of a germ before, you sound batshit insane. Like you sound completely unreasonable. When that person tells you and said, no, I did this because I was bitten by a snake when I was 9. And you're like, okay, I can't disprove that you got this illness because you got bitten by a snake when you were 9. But I also can't convince you that germs are real because I sound like a crazy person. So you have to find ways to kind of work together on a common understanding of health. Right. And in particular in those spaces, unfortunately, maternal health and women's health and female health and children's health is always particularly challenging. So when I came back and went through and I started doing some grad school work, I had an academic advisor who was like, you know what, like you should consider taking a feminist angle. And it was really interesting and challenging for me because feminist theory was something I critiqued really heavily as being what we call ethnocentric in the field. So that means that it's a discipline or a theory that only works in specific cultural contexts. And I would say early feminism, that could absolutely be true, and some iterations of it that can be true. But I think there's a way to be multicultural and feminist as well in how you interpret your stuff. And so I did grad school learning how to be a feminist, basically, specifically looking at how gender and health and risk factors kind of integrated. And that really added another layer of depth to my understanding of how women and female persons both experience health and then are understood in a global context as beings who pursue health.
What an awesome thing for your academic advisor to suggest to you. I hope that they still do that to every medical student,
Yeah.
no matter if they're taking an anthropology route or not.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
It was very cool. And he was very kind when I said, like, I'm not sure that this theory set is something I agree with in its lack of context.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, here are some scholars, go read their work, come back, and we can talk about it some more. And I'm glad he did.
Yeah.
Any top scholars you would recommend?
Well, okay, so yes and no. How much do you want to just like melt into the floor and not know anything anymore?
Oh my God, I love those kind of things.
Yeah, hit us with it. We just, I mean, obviously this is not like the same at all, but in our episode that just came out on PMS, I had a little moment where I just sort of did a mini takedown of Freud, and I felt kind of weird about it after, and then I had so many people on Instagram after that kind of clip came out who were like, yeah, fuck Freud, and I was like, oh, cool, everyone's backing me up here.
I mean, he's highly debunked and a little bit crazy, so yeah.
Oh yeah.
Totally.
Oh yeah.
But if you want, and what's really nice, Canadian scholar, Pirko Markula. Dr. Pirko Markula is a Foucauldian scholar who studies governmentality, agency, and the ways by which we can take Foucault's work and reinterpret it through a feminist lens. And she specifically looks at technologies of self, so how we quantify and measure our experiences in a digital capacity, and then use that to reconstruct our identities.
Whoa,
that's intense.
That's so intense.
She's so smart, and my brain is always like, I cannot.
I mean, I can barely read
that kind of
Foucault just on its own. So, I mean, yeah the interpretation is like, okay, you got it.
Yeah, that's so funny. I love it. Well, it sounds like a really cool journey that you took. I mean, from everything like going to West Africa to coming back to like changing kind of the direction that you were going.
Yeah, so what ended up kind of being like, I'm assuming you finished graduate school, and then what like pushed you into the direction of like software, really? So we should say My Normative is an app that is for cycle tracking, essentially for I guess it's for everyone really, but it sort of has a focus on athleticism and how it affects your cycle. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I would say our business speakers that are like launching our beachhead population is kind of female persons who unfortunately are, and we talked about this before, and not unfortunately, but just we're limited to cisgendered persons because of the state of the science and the limitations around it. We don't have a baseline for like normal hormonal functioning. So as soon as you start adding extra layers, things get wild. Who have some sort of health and wellness goal. So that can be activity based, and it is for a lot of people when they start looking at trackers. But really what we want to try and do is take the cycle and break it out of just being a cycle, because I think a lot of people think the menstrual cycle is their period, and it's not. They're two different things. One is a component of the other, and one has really broad impacts on the body. So we track your sleep with you, your mood with you, your motivation with you, your appetite with you, your activity levels, how fast you go at different points in your cycle, how slow you go at different points in your cycle. So we really try and take those hormonal influences that we know are happening and make it meaningful in a broader context.
Right. That's awesome.
Yeah.
How we got to software. Basically, my co-founder, Renee, and I, we were teammates in university and in grad school. In order to not turn into couch potatoes, we went for runs twice a week together.
Awesome. Nice.
And we both basically would get together and just, she was also in female health, but she focused on how physical activity could be a quality of life marker in female persons who survived reproductive cancers.
Oh,
whoa.
Wow.
Yeah, so she's an epidemiologist, which I can now say, and everyone knows what it is because of COVID. Before COVID, if I said she's an epidemiologist, they're like, a dermatologist?
Yeah.
No.
That's so true.
So
now
cool.
we all know what an epidemiologist is now.
Yeah.
So she focuses on female health factors in that field, which is really cool. And both of us would just gripe because when you try and do research on women and female persons, there is nothing to pull from, and it's changing slowly. But then like number one justifications for the exclusion of female persons from clinical trials is like, oh well, female hormones are too complicated. And they're really not, but there isn't a body of data or literature that's broadly available and accessible and scalable that enables people to more easily include female persons. And so we just don't. And we were like, someone should do something about that.
Yes.
Yeah.
But very few people actually do.
Very few people do. It's kind of wild, I think. And I mean, I don't know if we've told you this, but like what sparked us creating this podcast was just that exact fact. Was like there were so many things that we were learning, like, oh, all these like clinical trials just didn't include any women of like menstruating age. They were all like post menopausal, and like all these things just kept coming up. Like, what? Like, so the medical industry is just like completely avoiding using women or females because their hormones are too difficult to like factor into their studies. And
even like lab animals as well. Like it's not just like it's non-humans also. It's just like we're not included anywhere because it's interesting. Like the thing that I've seen over and over again is like either we're so simple that we're 70% of a man, or we're so complicated that our hormones will completely skew the data and it will fuck up the study. So it's like either we're like vanilla or every flavor mixed together, and
with sprinkles.
No one can figure it out.
Exactly.
Which, like, I mean, I get it, but also like, and again, also the point of this podcast, like, I call bullshit. Like, and that's like what you guys are doing is totally possible. It's just incredibly frustrating that not as many people are joining you. So yeah, tell us about the birth of this wonderful thing.
So a small trend you may notice in my life is I decide to do things on a whim. And so much like waking up one morning and deciding to move to West Africa, I was like, someone should really do something about this. And so it's like, I should do something about this. Luckily, I had enough like life experience to not just like fully jump in with both feet, but I spent about a year I did something called the 52 project, where I reviewed a software and a hardware for once a week for 52 weeks for a year, trying to find, because I assumed my hypothesis had to be incorrect. Someone had to be tracking women and female persons properly. Surely. This is a multi-trillion-dollar industry. Someone has to be doing this. And the answer was no. Like I tried from really basic fundamental softwares to like complex hardwares, trying to find something that took my hormones into consideration and didn't just like give me a percentage of my husband's caloric output after exercise.
Right.
And instead, everything I got was just a percentage of my husband's caloric output whenever we exercised together. It was basically like size and weight caloric expenditure versus size and weight caloric expenditure. Like it was very reverse engineerable how they came to the numbers, and I was like, okay, this is not, it's not helpful.
No.
And I would say so. The time I spent, I spent time in West Africa and in either West Asia or very, very Eastern Europe, kind of on that cusp there, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan.
Right. Oh my goodness.
Those two spaces that lasted a lot of my 20s. And when I left, we all had Sony Ericssons, and when I came back, smartphones existed.
Of course.
So I missed that. And so I would say I'm like a self-proclaimed Luddite. Like I'm not technologically good. Like I missed the smart revolution and came back.
I look at Raven. Raven's
That's me. That's me
100%.
I'm just considering buying a Chromecast at the moment. I'm pretty sure I'm gonna have to get Sada's husband to come over and set it up for me, even though I know it's just one plug. I'm like, I can't do it.
Do not trust me with that technology.
No,
something will go wrong. And so when I was looking at like scalability in terms of building a company that actually addressed this, I was like, nobody can trust me with building this company. I need to find somebody who like actually does this. And so part of the 52 project was like, what do apps do? What do hardwares do? Like, how can I understand them? What is the kind of current status quo, and what are people accepting as like the minimum barrier for entry? Because Uber didn't start out where it is today. It had like a rudimentary form built on itself, and same thing with Facebook. And so just trying to figure out like, okay, what can I get away with that still does the job it needs to do?
Yeah, right.
And then how can I iterate on that process? And we're just actually in September going to launch version 2 of the software.
Cool. Ooh, that's exciting.
It's very exciting. It's much cuter, and the data you need to know is like much easier to find. And it's just one of those iterative processes. I think it's really important. So yeah, I found a team of people who are willing to put up with me knowing nothing about tech.
Nice.
Perfect.
I love it. That's so awesome.
That's amazing. I'm really excited. And potentially even by the time this episode comes out, that second 2.0 will be ready. So people should look out for it.
Exactly.
So something that we do need to define for the rest of this conversation is what is the difference between sex and gender? There is much debate in the world, even though there's lots of science, and so we have a scientist here.
Pass it off to you.
How are these two things defined? What is the difference?
Yeah, so just in case they don't mention this when they do the intro, this is the second taping of this. In the first taping, I did a really good job of explaining this, and I do not think I'm going to do as good of a job today.
No, that's okay. Do the exact same thing. We had technical difficulties in the first one, and Danika is so kind to come back and give us this 2.0 of this interview. Exactly. But I loved the analogy that you used in the first one, and that was one of the things I was the most sad to lose about that interview. So I'm hoping you can take us through it again, is the analogy of the royalty and the crown. So take us there. So
what I would say is, there are lots of different definitions of both sex and gender. And it really wasn't until the 90s that we really started to separate out these two concepts. So it's actually a really recent innovation in the field. And so when we think about sex, typically what people think about is kind of the biological function of a plant or person or fauna of some variety and what its reproductive capacity is. And then you think about its gender as the expression of the different masculinities and femininities associated with that biological function. And so where you get often conflict is different cultures have different interpretations of what the masculinities and femininities attached to different sexes are. And that's because gender is not and cannot be sex, but is supposed to hypothetically, or in our old state, be representative of. And so the metaphor I used last time, and I think is a really good metaphor, is in the line of semiotics and semantics. So it's the difference when you talk about gender. Gender is supposed to be a metaphor for sex, and the example we used is the crown is not the queen. But when we all look at the crown, we can agree that it is a thing that is supposed to stand for the queen, but it does not have any of the active power of the queen. It cannot talk to you. It cannot make decisions, but it is a representation of. And so it is the thing that is supposed to stand for the thing, but it's not the thing itself. Whereas
it's the symbol. Yeah.
Yes. Whereas sex is the thing that does the thing. So it has a reproductive function to it.
Yeah. Awesome.
That is so
I love
clear.
that. I love that analogy. I think it's just it's very, very simple, but it's really straightforward of exactly the queen is the one that signs the documents, the one that actually has the power. But then the crown is what everybody kind of tends to look to as oh, okay, that's royalty. That's the queen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the really beautiful segue we made last time successfully was when we talked about this. So the difference between a sign and a symbol, right? So a symbol is a thing that stands for the thing that is not the thing, but the sign is the thing, like a stop sign. So when you see a stop sign, you stop.
Yes.
When the queen signs on something, it is a signature, it has active power, and it kind of has agency, it has an impact, it creates change. And what we don't have in terms of sex and consensus in the scientific community is what is the active agent, what is the sign in sex that is the most important in determining biological reproductive function, which is why it turns into a mess as soon as you try and define sex.
Right. But also
what makes that symbol something that you would see and that culturally you would recognize as also, even though most people, even if they are extremely not understanding of just like not all bodies do certain things, you know, let's say like a complete like Luddite sees a woman and is like, yes, women have babies, but not all women and who identify and look like women can get pregnant. And so it turns into this whole like mess of using gender and attaching gender to chromosomes. And I did kind of want to touch on that again also, is like we all know, like, or most people know, you know, XX is women and XY is men technically, but there are a lot of variations of chromosomes that kind of lie dormant. And I just kind of wanted to, touch a little bit on, what did we call it again? Was it intersex conditions?
Yeah.
So how many variations of chromosomes really are there in general? Like,
So I'm not a geneticist. We touched on this last time.
Right.
I don't want to step out of my scope, but there are a lot. And I would say that we don't know all of them because we don't go around testing people's chromosomes, right? We just look at the phenotypic expression of sex. So we look at like, oh, it has these genitals, therefore it must be this XX or XY.
Right.
Yeah. So very infrequently do we actually do chromosomal testing. And so we are just on the brink of discovering exactly how much variability we have in those sex chromosomes, even as just like one example of a chromosome pairing that we would be looking at, which is fascinating. But we've talked about like you can have Turner syndrome, or you can have just an X or just a Y. You can have XXY. You can have, and we talked about this last time, you can have XX or XY genes, but or chromosomes, and then have the gene be transmitting across on either side or missing from the Y or on the X. So there's lots of variability that you can have within the chromosomes. So not even just the variations of chromosomes, but like on each chromosome, you can have variability.
Right, because this is another thing that I thought was so interesting that I didn't know, is essentially your chromosomes carry around accessories, and the accessories are these like gender, or is it like a gender? No, what was it?
It's genetic.
Genetic
Something.
like what makes you basically.
Yeah, it's genetic materials.
Yeah, it's the chromosome doesn't necessarily make it up. It's almost like, I guess, kind of like the carrier for
that is a good
all these little things that go into, like, similar to DNA, I guess, in a way. It's like whatever makes you on the inside and the outside. These things are not one black and white stamp. They're actually way more dynamic,
so complicated
than I think a lot of people realize.
Yeah, and I think that's a good example, right? So like I think when people think about biology pieces, they think of like, oh, DNA, that's really small, right? They think of that that's like a microscopic thing. And then so by accident, especially when you're not a trained scientist, you go, therefore that is the smallest of the small. But your chromosomes are part of your DNA, right? So you have another layer of small on your small. And this is where things get wild. You could just parse things down into oblivion. There's always something smaller that is impacting and changing or arranging you in a specific way. And so when we get to like genes or alleles or chromosomes, we can be like, this is the end point. But there's always a mechanism that caused that thing to exist. And that always has an opportunity to create variability in the human species.
Wow. And I think that to me is like such a huge part of, I think, when the discussion around gender comes up. A lot of people, there's like the team that is like, we're only talking about sex here, like they're female or whatever, like their sex is female, their sex is male. And
it's biology.
It's biology. The classic. But like, even just if that is your statement, if that's what you're saying, then it's like, well, actually, it is so much more complicated than that. Like every aspect of it has a little accessory that could be changing it, that could be, like adjusting your physicality, all those things. And so I'm like, it's just not enough to say it's just biology. It's not enough to say it's just your sex is female, because that doesn't even really define it properly.
So that just turns into like your statement of that, like you're thinking too small for the small. Like,
Yeah.
you know, it's just like there's that
Yeah.
many layers. Is like you're not, and like again, like people, the whole point too of just like science in general, like whenever it's like the science was proven wrong or something like that, like I feel like for the most part, science is always trying to like grow by disproving things that we thought for a long time. That's how science kind of works. Like we didn't discover the atom until like what, like the early 40s, and we thought that was the smallest thing for the longest time. It's like we're always finding like new shit, and just to close your mind off to that and call it biology is so small.
Yeah.
Right? And I think when you run into those humans, and bless those humans, we're gonna put that out. I'm not from the South, but bless those humans who've only gotten like a high school level of education on biology, because it's so easy to, you get taught the like allele square. This is dominant, this is recessive, this is how it works. You get taught there's an XX and an XY, and those are your two options, and they have to combine one of these four ways. But that doesn't take into consideration that your genes are made up of alleles and your chromosomes are made up of genes. There's like this whole thing that's interacting on those surfaces, and that you have all of these variables that are interacting. Whenever you have variables, it means your species is more likely to survive an apocalypse. Go team, go. But also that you're going to have mutations, right? And things change over time.
Yeah.
And so I think a couple of years ago, I had a girlfriend, really well-intentioned. She was talking to a friend of ours, and it was like, I can accept that there can be like variability in gender, but like sex is sex. And I think it'd be really tough when so much of your population only has a very minimal understanding of what biological sex is, right? And I think people over-credit chromosomes, and they don't credit physical expressions of sex. Most people don't get a chromosomal analysis done. They just have their genitals as indicative. And then you have so many people who have learned that is actually not the case, right? We talked about intersex populations earlier. 1.8% of the population, right? That is more than there are redheads in the world. Like that is a huge number of people that don't fit that binary.
That's so interesting, because we all know a redhead.
We do. We all do. We're looking at one right
now. But what's
Yeah.
interesting about that too is like, and like bathroom laws that have been coming out a lot and in the news lately, or just in the last few years. And like there's like a state that was trying to make your bathroom assignment, whichever one you're going to use, based on your chromosomes, which is like you'd have to have so many bathrooms, and then also just to assume that that's the chromosome you have. And like you said, like not a lot of people go and get their chromosomes tested, and if you do and you find out that potentially it's not what you thought it was, that can either be potentially a very enlightening thing to know or a very devastating thing to know. And so it's not like everyone should be running out and getting their chromosomes tested necessarily.
I don't know if mass testing of the general population for chromosomes is helpful. I think it's one of those things where testing is not always helpful, right? And it may be introducing complexities into your life that if they're not causing you harm, maybe you don't need to know about.
Some things can stay mysterious. It's okay.
Seriously.
But some things are better left unsaid.
But I mean, like, even like, I think just something to think about though is like, if people keep pushing that it's biology, it's your chromosomes, it's like, well, you can't really say that. Like, you can't say, oh, it's based off your chromosomes, because we don't know. I've never had my chromosomes tested. I don't know that I'm not some weird mixture of something. I have no idea what I am. So it's like nobody can define me as biologically anything. Like, I present a certain way, but that's it. That's all, And
it's based off of your symbols, your genitalia, assuming they have a specific reproductive function. And that's okay. For most of the population, that assumption is a safe population or a safe one, but it's not 100% accurate.
No, exactly.
Very true.
It's so interesting.
That's a lot to think about just in general. Like, okay, I wanted to have a discussion about the spectrum that everyone's talking about these days. And there is a lot of evidence to say that sex is on a spectrum. I feel like that is pretty well identified now as being a truth. Some people are not into it and want to stick with the binary. But is a spectrum the most accurate representation of like gender, or do you feel like there potentially is a better like thing to imagine when we're talking about gender and where everyone can land?
So I think that's really interesting, and I think we can talk about both sex and gender as something that is, or two constructs or definitions that are currently being, I would call them spectrumed. And I think what's interesting is I think spectrums are the visual du jour. Like, I think people just like putting everything on a spectrum right now.
Yeah, it's very true.
Right? You have ADHD on a spectrum. You have autism on a spectrum. Everything's on a spectrum.
Everything's on a spectrum.
But I think the problem with spectrums is and scientists love spectrums because they are linear, right? They go in a straight line from one point to another.
Right.
And what, to me, the problem of that, and we can absolutely get into a fight about it. Maybe we're not the people who will fight about it, but like other scientists who come into the comments, is I don't know that absolute reproductive biology in terms of masculinities and feminities is the spectrum, right? Because if you are a non-reproducing entity that has a biological function from like an evolutionary standpoint, and I don't know that it's actually neutral or in the middle, it could be somewhere else on the playing field, and I don't think it fits tidily into a line. Likewise with gender, which is different. Right now we have a gender spectrum, but I don't think that the masculinities and feminities performed as symbols associated with someone's reproductive function are necessarily linear. And I don't know that neutral activities, A, are neutral across different cultures, and B, are neutral in function. Like, they're still very important identity markers in a person and have functions in society that I don't think we should minimize as neutral or in the middle. And so I advocate for zigzags and crisscrosses and maybe multiple squiggly lines.
I like it. I think
it's sort of like a spiral nest situation more, and like nothing. The thing is too is like very few things in the world, even mathematically, are linear. And also too, like, especially when it comes to gender and kind of in the world that I'll say some of us are living in at the moment, is like your expression of your identity can be anywhere if you feel safe enough to do it. It doesn't have to fall at a certain place in a line. Like, I think one thing that we mentioned before too is just like, if you are a cisgendered heterosexual male who likes to wear skirts or even certain colors, like, does that mean that you're like quote unquote getting in touch with your feminine side, or does that just mean that you're expressing yourself?
And I don't think that should move you anywhere on this, right? Like, it's
not moving you on the spectrum.
Really,
it's just you being
metaphor.
you. Yes. Yeah, I think so too. And I think I think that's why I like the spaghetti, like, bird's nest view of it or whatever.
Because I'm like, I think that's such a good point, is like, even if you do have a tendency, or like you have, some days you want to be a little bit more masculine, some days more feminine, maybe you just want to be neutral. I don't necessarily think that means you need to swing over the spectrum, that means you're now identifying more as masculine, or either way. Like, I think it's just such a broad playing field that you as a person, how you identify and present, it's really just more about identity. It's not so much about this, like, which end of the spectrum are you sitting on.
Yeah. And I think that's why, so whenever I talk about performing masculinities and femininities, they're plural on purpose, because there isn't one ultimate masculinity and one ultimate femininity.
Thank God.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are lots of different versions across different cultures, across different generations, across different, I will call them like cultures within a culture. We have lots of subcultures and niche cultures in different spaces. And often, like, so as an example for myself, my mom used to like kind of make fun of me growing up because I was a jock. and a model. and so she'd be like, you're either in sweatpants or high heels. Like those are, you have these two different identities. That you, and that's still very much to this day my personality. But to me, they just have different functions in my life. And so not that I'm an advocate for like structural functionalism, but like how a thing is supposed to work has an impact on whether or not I use it. And it doesn't matter if it's masculine or feminine. If something has something I can use it for, and it doesn't offend any of my sensibilities in any way, I will absolutely use it for that. And I think what's really something I've noticed before, and we can talk about this with like feminism from like the 80s and 90s if we wanted to.
Let's do it.
Because they've come back into style, the shoulder pads and your jackets that are supposed to like make you take up space and kind of be this imposing space. I think in some ways that became like a feminative performative action, feminine from performative action, but that like emulated masculinity. But I don't think it actually emulated masculinity. I think it emulated power.
Absolutely. I actually know, I mean, I'm a fashion history person, 100%. And it is fully, that's exactly what it was in the 80s. Women were going into the corporate workforce for the first time ever. And the only other time that shoulder made another appearance was in the 1940s. And what was going on? There were no men around. They were at war.
They were going,
and the women at home were wearing these strong suits. They weren't wearing big, also it was fabric rationing back then as well for the war effort, but like they were wearing silhouettes and cuts that exuded power. And why? Because they felt powerful. It doesn't have anything really to do with gender. It has to do with how you feel and your freedom to express how you're feeling. And how fucking cool is that?
It's super cool. It's so funny. I was just this week, I was at Value Village with my mom and we were shopping around and she turns to me, she's like, why are power suits not a thing anymore? And I was like, I just don't think that it was exactly that. I was like, when women were entering the workforce, they needed to show a visible presence of themselves in the corporate world. And I was like, I think power is shown differently today than it was then. And we don't need it to be so like
jagged.
So jagged and intense. I think we can be powerful in a different way. And I think she still missed the 80s power suits, but
some people do. I'm not gonna lie, I kind of do. They're pretty, they're intense. I know my mom loathes them, but my mom's another breed. So, but
I just thought it was funny.
But it really does come down to that, and I think that a lot of the fear of like feeling like you need to put people in like certain bathrooms and certain categories and not let certain people play certain sports and all that shit is not to use the old cliche, but it's like you might just be really like sad and insecure and repressed. Like you might really benefit from having some freedom to express yourself, but you're so like caught up in what everyone's supposed to be doing. We miss out on so much by trying to perform what these gender roles are. Now we're off on a tangent about gender roles, but it all kind of does end up coming back to that because it goes back to this like idea that like biology is the truth, but you don't even know what biology is.
No.
And I think what's particularly terrifying is when people, so say you construct this gender identity based off of your assumed biological sex, whatever that means. And then at some point, for whatever reason, you find out that the assumption you made on how you perform your sex is maybe the sex part is actually the inaccurate part. Does that change your gender identity? I don't think it needs to. And so I think there's this really awful weight of the masculinities and femininities that we perform and how they are attached still to reproductive function. And so any woman or female person who has lost their ovaries, had to have a hysterectomy, found out they don't have a uterus, that does not make you any less woman or female. Like,
precisely. Yeah, exactly.
I know that's a huge fear with anyone who has hysterectomy or a mastectomy. with the removal of the breasts. And then
Mm-hmm.
I know because that's also a thing is like, do you want to like refill the breasts? Because you can get that. And that's like a whole other thing that's like, whoa, like, you know, there's lots of reasons to get it. I'm not knocking anyone who like does that, but it's just like, geez, like, is that really like important to who you are?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
For some people it is.
is.
Yeah. I guess it's kind of like, you know, wearing a wig or whatever, if that makes you.
Yeah. Or even just like,
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think like just that's something that I think we've like talked about so much is not just like because we obviously deal with menstruation, and menstruation is just like a bodily function if you have you know, the reproductive organs functioning a certain way.
Mhm.
And to then basically obviously we're catering to a very in that sense specific group of people. You do have to have this particular bodily function. And in that sense, like we've, you know, had so much flack thrown our way when we decide to not gender our customer, because we truly believe people can identify however they want, but we're serving a bodily function. Like you can come to us, you can,
Yeah. At the end of the day, it serves a purpose.
it serves a very, very particular purpose. And as well, I think it's like that same thing you were just saying. Like there are women out there that identify as female who don't have that function for whatever reason, whether it's hysterectomy or they genetically were born different, like all those things. And it's like, if we then just always continue to connect women, their like identity as whatever bodily function, you know, we're promoting, then it's again, I think to the detriment of women. We're just always saying your bodily function is who you are. But then people get really angry at us for promoting a bodily function. Like, but it's like, it's literally what we're doing. Like, we're just serving people with this function. But then people get so angry that we point out, hey, we're selling this to people who menstruate. And then it's like this whole conversation of like, don't group me as just someone that menstruates. So that's my rant.
I think it's really tough because I think we're trying as a culture and as a society to find spaces for this flexibility in our language.
Yeah.
And I will just say, as somebody who studied languages for a while, like English is a terrible language. It's not very descriptive. It's a very vulgar language.
It is vulgar, yeah.
It's not helpful.
No.
And so whenever I see something that's like, hey, menstruators, I'm like, that's really reductivist. I don't want to do that. And so I do prefer people who menstruate.
Yeah.
But we're in semantics at that point, right?
Exactly.
So what you're trying to like, somebody who does really well is actually, do you guys ever watch Mama Dr. Jones?
No.
Who's that?
She's a YouTuber. She's an OBGYN, and she has been doing stuff for forever. And people only figured out really recently that she doesn't gender anything in her videos.
Oh,
that's
I
so
like
interesting.
it.
Is like if you just don't tell people, most of the time nobody notices.
Nobody notices. Yeah.
Right. And so like there were some people who were like, I'm unfollowing you. I can't believe it. She's like, if you never had a problem with my content until now, you don't actually have a problem with me not gendering things. You have an internalized
issue,
like, sexism issue, effectively, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And so it's super fascinating to see players like that just be like, you know what, we're just not going to gender people, and who don't use it as like a people like talk about kind of value signaling, and instead of she just this doctor just didn't. She just like was like, I don't need to do it. It's not pertinent to the conversation. And I find people who successfully do that with language so like worship worthy. I'm like, you are amazing.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. Well, no, one thing that we've talked about, like I think we talked about this in an episode that we did with a period coach. Their name is Victoria Alexander. Is like, the thing is, if you are holding space for people who are, you know, of a certain ilk, let's say, you can show up as an ally for people who aren't going through what you're going through. Like you can still be invited to the party to be supportive and to be, there and to witness and validate, but it doesn't have to be about you. And I think a lot of people on both sides of where they're at with spectrums and gender expression and stuff like that really struggle with feeling left out. And maybe that's just because in our culture right now, a lot of people are feeling really left out, rightly so or wrongly so. So
yeah, and I do think that we have a bit of a knee-jerk reaction in the kind of, especially for women and female persons who identify themselves by their reproductive roles, because there's so few things in which I feel like women and female persons can really claim power. And so I think some of that knee-jerk reaction is from like, no, this is something only my sex can do or something only my gender can do. Don't take that away from me, right? Sorry, my dog is having a meltdown. That's okay. I don't know. I'm looking around. Usually it's the UPS guy, but it's a bit late for him.
But
that's so true. I was like, just as like a total like weird aside, but I recently watched the like 6-part QAnon documentary. That's, if you're Canadian, it's on Crave. I was like, let me see what these people are on about, and it was very interesting and enlightening. But one thing that I found really interesting was like watching these women. They identify as women and they're all like cisgendered and stuff. Be like so gung ho about some of the shit that was going on. With this movement, and I was like, how? I don't understand. And then I was talking to my mom about it. My mom was like, they see an opportunity to kind of have some power that normally men take up. They see a place where they can feel like they're in power in a space with men rather than like kind of somewhere else, if that makes sense. And I was like, oh yeah, it literally is. It just all kind of comes back to feeling seen and heard. And sometimes you just go a little off with how we.
Sometimes people get a little aggro
where we put
it.
our energy.
Yeah. But okay, I guess like something we did touch on this last time we spoke, but like, why do you think there's the camp of people saying it's biology, and then the camp of people just kind of like, accepting it, are okay with it, don't really need to fight about it. They're just like chill.
Yeah, is it science that some people really need, or are some people just kind of more culturally inclined to accept things that maybe like don't hurt them? Basically, it's like, you tell me you feel a certain way, and I'll accept it. I don't need to understand it.
Okay, so we have this standing joke in my house with my husband where sometimes you just get your feelings hurt because something is different than you thought it was going to be, or it's changed from how it was before. So whenever we're having one of those emotional reactions, we'll just be like, change is bad. just like, and that's kind of our way to be like, I'm having like a very unrational response to this piece of information, and I will come back to it later. So like, it's a standing joke in a household that's maybe overly nerdy, but I think when we don't, like we've talked about, like most people aren't biologists, they're not geneticists, they don't know any of these things, and so I think over time people can be exposed to new information and just accept it, and they don't need to have the scientific validation behind it. They can just kind of like be faced with new information, and that information doesn't have to be biologically based. It can just be like, this person feels better when they express themselves, and they have the emotional capacity to be like, fine, like, cool, you are a male person who wears lipstick, that's cool, right? Like, and they don't need further explanation. Whereas for some people who see those symbols, so lipsticks, I think originated, you're the fashion person, but like originated in Egypt with prostitutes, right? Like, so there's like a fertility actual piece to the like life cycle.
It means that you're like, the idea of lipstick, and same thing with kind of like rouge on the cheeks, is like when you're turned on, you get flushed. So it's a symbol that you're kind of like ready.
right? And it's typically associated with females. And I think originally, like even going back to like a behavioral and like evolutionary point, baboons get ischiocolosities that swell, that indicate that they are an estrus and fertile. So they like literally have these lips on their body that swell to say like, I'm ready.
Wait,
Wait,
what is a boon?
what's a boon? Yeah.
Like a baboon.
Oh,
like
baboon. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I was like, what's a boon?
What's a boon? A baboon. Oh my God, that's so
so interesting.
Think about like biologically and evolutionarily, there are lots of things that we do because we are just giant apes walking around being silly that kind of emulate some of those historical things. And just in humans too, like our lips swell, our cheeks flush, our vaginal lips swell. We change colors, we get bigger, we get smaller. Lots of things happen, and so you can see lipstick as kind of this thing that says you're ready to go, but it's also based on like evolutionarily, demonstrating fertility as a feminine or female entity.
Right.
And so people who've accidentally, I would say, like anchored it in an innateness. So red lipstick means I am an estrus in their head.
Right.
That can be like, that's not possible on a male person. Therefore, this metaphor is broken and mixed and doesn't work. And that can be a really shocking, almost violent experience for them.
Yeah.
Oh,
wow.
When you say violent, that makes me think of a lot of like things that have been going on in the last few years. Like, just even like how many trans women have been beaten to death because of things like wearing makeup and something like that. Like, that's such an interesting way to put it, because also, like, to me, like, I feel like both Sarah and I are just sort of like more inclined to like, if you say this is how you feel, who am I to question how you're feeling and just accept it? And so to hear you say that can be like a violent thing for someone to not accept, and it just like doesn't compute. Like, I've never really thought about it in such a like kind of straight and narrow way. And it's just like, I don't know, I think this is so crunchy, but I feel a lot of empathy in this moment for someone who's experiencing that. It's just like, I'm so sorry.
It's so true.
That
I think like the idea that what you're kind of saying is like, I have so much room for just not really needing to understand when it comes to gender. But then, because I know there's so much complexity, like I'm like, it's not something I need to know why, because I know it's so complex. I know they don't even really necessarily know why. They just know how they want to present. And then if you kind of almost think about like what you just described, even if a person has no idea about these facts about lipstick or baboons or anything, that I think we as humans, we absorb so much more than we comprehend or like consciously even accept. So if someone has like a violent reaction or just like it just upsets them to their core, that there's a lot of complexness behind that, and that they aren't necessarily even aware. They just know this is not right in their mind, and therefore I'm against it. Like it's not really like maybe digging into like, why is
also,
that? Like why does that cause such a reaction?
Like, I have to fix it when you see something is wrong like that, which is really like devastating to think about.
Yeah.
But whoa.
Yeah.
It's got deep.
It got real deep.
I can't remember which theorist it was. This is like from a third year undergraduate class, but there's a really famous theorist that I learned about at some point. If somebody knows, drop it somewhere, email it to me. They defined violence as the breaking of social contract. So anything that breaks social contract is violence. And so, which is why, like, if you get groped on the bus by a stranger, that is violence done to a person. But if like it's somebody you're in a romantic relationship and have consent to, that is not violence, because it's not breaking your social contract. That's how you can have the same action mean different things, according to the theorist. And I've really taken that with me as a very useful definition, because it explains so many of those like knee-jerk reactions to things where you're like, this shouldn't be hurting me this way, but I cannot accept that. And a lot of that has to do with the accidental I would say like rigor or reification of metaphors in our mind for things that stand for the thing but are not the thing itself. Like lipstick being a sign of female fertility on a male person,
Right.
that can feel like they've broken the contract that you have around what that symbol is supposed to represent.
Yeah.
Which doesn't excuse you beating up people on the street, but it gives you space to understand, like, and it's really interesting because I think as a multilingual person, pig to some people it has like an innate pigness about it, right? They're like, oh, pig, like it. When you hear the word pig, you just think of like a four-legged creature who goes oink oink and rolls in mud. But like then, if you speak any other language and somebody just says pig at you, you're like, that that doesn't mean anything to me.
No.
And so I think there's a lot of innateness that people accidentally assume in their symbols, and when they get into conflict and those innate things are challenged, that's where that violent reaction comes from.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah.
Oh man,
it's so cool. Can we just have you on every week?
Yeah, we want to talk to you all the time. You give us so much to think about. That's like
this episode's been completely different than the last one, but it's just so interesting.
Equally as important. Unfortunately, we were the only ones to get to experience it the last time. It was
just for us.
Still.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my God. Yeah. Well, we kind of have to, we're nearing the end of our time here. Yeah. And so where can people find you, find My Normative? I think everything that you're doing is so valuable, and I really hope that people will track you down in a good way. So, yeah.
No social violence, please.
Respect my personal space. Absolutely.
So you can find me on social. So for My Normative, we have at my.normative on Instagram, or at My Normative on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, maybe even on TikTok. I stalk TikTok, but I don't post a lot on TikTok, if that's fair.
It's a pretty overwhelming platform. Yeah. I'm the same way.
Yeah. And then personally, if you like what I do, just kind of like from a science perspective and my work with My Normative, you can find me at Danika on Instagram. That's where I post kind of my cranky feminist memes and my unsolicited thoughts on different human evolutionary topics.
I love
We're right there with you.
Yeah, I love it so much.
Oh my goodness. Danika, thank you so much. And thank you so much for all the work that you do. It's so valuable, and we really appreciate you. And we really appreciate you coming on here a second time to talk to us.
Seriously.
Thank you for having me.
Have a wonderful night.
And bye.
Bye.
Why So Mysterious is hosted by Sara Jonsdottir and Raven McLean. Audio is produced and edited by Sonia Inke. Original music is by Malcolm Holt and Alexis Young.
Check out our website, whysomysterious.com, for more information about this episode and other episodes. You can also email us with questions or topics you'd like to hear us cover on the show at whysomysteriousPod@gmail.com.
Follow us on Instagram at whysomysteriousPod for updates, fun facts, and general outrage. If you're an audio listener, but you'd rather be a voyeur, check us out on YouTube.
If you like the show, tell your friends, and don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Until next time!